right. Thank you all for joining the Watt Coalition's National Clean Energy Week webinar. I'm excited to have these great panelists with us today to share how we can unlock the energy transition with grid-enhancing technologies. I'm Julia Selker. I'm the Executive Director of the Watt Coalition, and I'll kick off this discussion with a little bit of background on what each grid-enhancing technology does, how it works, as well as some of the reasons why this is so urgent for the energy transition. But then we'll let these panelists get into more detail on the technology, on the problems we're solving. And the goal here is to have everyone learn something today. We have some folks who are new to grid enhancing technologies on the call, and then we have some folks who've been thinking about them for a long time. So we're trying to offer everyone a bit of what they need today. So on that note, if you have questions as we go through the presentations, please put them in the Q&A. We'll answer them live or in writing, and feel free to add to the stack whenever. So just to quickly introduce our speakers, we have Rodica Donaldson, who's the Vice President of Transmission Analytics at EDF Renewables. She'll be talking about how congestion and inadequate transmission capacity are affecting existing renewable generators and generator interconnection, and then also touching on topology optimization software, which is one of the grid enhancing technologies. Mark Norton, the Vice President of European Business Development at SmartWires, and also an expert on grid modernization generally, is going to explain power flow control, advanced power flow control in more detail, and also share some examples of how it's deployed. Robert Mork, Vice President of International Regulatory Affairs at Heimdall Power, and Hilary Pearson, Vice President of Policy and External Affairs at LineVision and the Chair of the Watt Coalition, will both talk about different versions of dynamic line ratings and examples of how those are deployed. So we'll cover a spectrum of information here. Thanks everyone for joining. And with that, I'll get right into it. The Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies Coalition is a trade association that advocates for policy that supports the wide deployment of grid enhancing technologies. And we're looking to accelerate the clean energy transition and lower electricity costs. So our members are grid enhancing technology vendors, and then also clean energy interests, developers, finance, utilities with clean energy goals. So you can find out more about us on our website, watttransmission.org. And these are the technologies that we represent. I'm going to go through them in roughly the order we'll tackle them throughout the rest of the webinar. But the point here is that these are complementary technologies. They all increase transmission capacity and make use of the dynamic capabilities of the grid, and they work together to solve congestion and increase capacity. So first of all, topology optimization is software that is sort of like a Google Maps for the grid. It finds the best ways to reroute power flow to have efficient delivery. So you might see in this cartoon example, there's a curtailed wind generator because there's a congested line, and actually switching a different line off redistributes power across the system and resolves that congestion, and the wind generator can spin away. And so this, as you can see, the resolution of congestion can sometimes be through unintuitive actions. So you really need a software like topology optimization to be able to quickly find and evaluate grid reconfigurations and evaluate and see the whole system impact. So right now, utilities use reconfiguration, like the example we have here, to resolve reliability issues. But with this new software, you can look at a lot of different, a lot more scenarios and for other reasons. So Rodica will get into more details on that. But in one study, topology optimization could have reduced PJM congestion costs by 50% on average over the course of a year. And I'll get into this later, but congestion costs in 2022 in PJM were $2.5 billion. So we're looking at significant economic value out of this technology, which is currently mostly used for reliability. So one example of grid enhancing technology. The next is advanced power flow control, and these are devices that go at the substations. And in our cartoon example, you can see that you have one line that's overloaded and two circuits that are less utilized. And once you install power flow control devices, you can push power off of the overloaded circuit, pull it onto the underloaded circuit, and then you have capacity for more generation. So deployments in the UK, I believe it was 48 devices. So these make use of the mesh network that we have, unlocked capacity for 1.5 gigawatts of new renewable energy, and that saved UK ratepayers over $500 million. Numbers different in pounds, but I figure we have a US audience here. And then dynamic line ratings are our third grid enhancing technology. So these are sensors that go on or near the transmission line or towers, and they measure the capacity of the lines. So most often in the United States, lines have a static rating, maybe a seasonal rating, and that assumes the worst case scenario. It's hot, there's not very much wind, and the power is heating up the line, and the ambient conditions aren't really cooling it. Well, if you use dynamic line ratings, you can tell how the line is being cooled by, it is or is not being cooled by ambient conditions. So wind speed has a huge effect on cooling. And if a line overheats, it starts to sag, and that's not acceptable. It could damage the equipment. But if it's being cooled, you can run more current on that line. So in one study, which was highlighted by this resource that the Idaho National Laboratory put together, which I really appreciate, but across 3 states, dynamic line ratings exceeded the static line rating by 9 to 33% in winter and 26 to 36% in summer. So that's a big increase in the capacity of those lines. And it exceeded the static line rating only 85% of the time. So that's 15% of the time that the static line rating was either correct or actually it wasn't conservative enough. And as we see heat domes and other extreme weather becoming more common, we might need to be more conservative even than the static line rating. Of course, not all the time. So dynamic line ratings can unlock capacity benefits and then also reliability benefits in that way. And I'll let the vendors talk more about different applications, but there are a few reasons why this is really urgent to start using grid enhancing technologies. So transmission congestion costs are growing significantly over the last few years, and that's driven by increasing gas prices, increasing renewable energy, but the underlying issue is that there's not sufficient transmission capacity to deliver the lowest cost electricity. And that's sort of what congestion measures, that difference between the lowest cost energy and the energy you had to deliver instead because of a transmission constraint. So this number will just keep growing, and that represents additional costs to the consumer. And gets help because they can double capacity on the existing grid for new renewable energy to be deliverable. So in a study that the Brattle Group put forward or completed with help from the Watt Coalition and some great funders, we looked at the Kansas and Oklahoma grids and the existing interconnection queues and found, like I said, twice as much capacity on the grid for new renewable energy when you install GETS strategically across the grid. So that's dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow control, and topology optimization. Really encourage curious parties to check out the study in full. It's on our website. But that's what we're trying to do here. And then, like I mentioned, we're also looking for resilience and reliability benefits. So with dynamic line ratings, you see the true capacity of the line. With topology optimization, you see your options for reconfigurations. And with advanced power flow control, you can move power on and off of circuits. So you get this enhanced awareness and flexibility, and a few examples of how GETS can help mitigate the impacts of outages. So you can increase capacity and avoid congestion costs or redispatch. And you can also use topology optimization for outage scheduling. For instance, if you know you're going to have to take an outage, you can make sure that it's done at a time that it won't, and in a way that won't impact the economics or reliability of your system. And finally, before I pass it on to our panelists, there are a few reasons why GETS aren't as commonly used in the United States as in other regions. One is just awareness. Utilities may not have used these technologies before. They've heard of them, but haven't seen them in the field. So that's something that all of our members are working on fixing. But part of why there hasn't been that investment in education is because utilities know that their current system works for reliability, even though we're seeing these increasing congestion costs and increasing interconnection queues. They don't have an incentive to innovate. And part of that is that they their business model is based on returns on their capital costs. So if they build a big line, they can see a return on equity for the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars they spend that's in proportion to that expenditure, while grid enhancing technologies are much cheaper. So there's no incentive to find the lowest cost solution in the United States. And we'll get into more of that later, but I want to pass it to Rodica here. And please bring in the questions as we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. And I share my screen, correct? It says I cannot start screen share. Oh, there you go. So, hi everyone. I'm very pleased to be on this call, talk a little bit about our experience as an renewable IPP with GETS and why we are interested in GETS and advocating for GETS. I will not talk too much about EDF renewables, just a couple of items for those of us who may not be familiar with EDF renewables. We are a large renewable IPP in North America, part of EDF group with a global presence. And in North America, we have developed over 60 gigawatts of renewables, and we have been around for over 35 years and with a lot of employees in North America. So without belittling too much, I will go straight to the transmission challenge. And Julia did talk a little bit about the interconnection challenge. And I'm going to cover why transmission is a challenge, both from an interconnection standpoint, but also from an operation standpoint. So I think everyone is aware of this Berkeley Lab study pointing out to how many obstacles and how many issues there are with the interconnection processes that are multi-year process. We can easily spend 5 years in the queue those days. Hopefully the reform will help from that was just finalized by FERC, but it's still a big challenge to get through the queue. Large queue sizes, record levels, queues, everyone is aware of that. And this also presents the challenge that the cost of interconnecting new generation can be very high, and you need multiple studies and restudies as some of those generators drop from the queue due to cost or other reasons. So I won't talk too much about the interconnection piece. There are many webinars those days about interconnection and what the reform means for the future, but I will just point out that yes, going through the interconnection process is a big challenge, but it's not the only challenge for renewables. So simply finalizing the interconnection is just a milestone in the life of a renewable project, and it's not the end of the transmission challenge. And what we are seeing today on the ground, we are seeing high levels of curtailment across many markets with more renewable penetration, higher renewable penetration. So just as an example, a few markets, SPP, CAISO, and ERCOT, we are systematically seeing curtailment of both wind and solar at a fleet level above 5% across the last several years. So curtailment is increasing materially for renewable assets. This is just an average. And on the ground, there are units that are getting curtailed above those levels. So that's the reality of operating a renewable asset, that you can be hit with this level of curtailment and even more. And this risk can only increase as we look at more renewable penetration and maybe lagging transmission expansion, which is what has caused the cost that Julia mentioned. I have the same chart, the same numbers, just presented differently, with material increase in congestion costs for ratepayers for the market in those regions. And I think also folks may be aware of another study done after the Inflation Reduction Act passed, noting the challenge that we have ahead of us in order to achieve the emission reduction that IRA is targeting, we also need to build a lot of transmission, and we need to utilize the transmission system to the best of our capabilities, and that includes utilization of gates. And maybe another challenge that not everyone is talking about for renewables, we have the curtailment risk, but there is also a risk relatively new in the market for the last several years called basis risk. And not all the renewable projects wear this risk, but for some, in particular, those that typically sign an offtake agreement with C&I customers, we have this risk as a generator, as a project. We may wear this risk of a price difference between where our project is interconnecting and the settlement point in those contracts. So many or all of those, most of those C&I deals put this price spread exposure on renewable assets. And the price exposure, the price spread is driven by congestion on the system. There are other, like a last piece here that may create a spread, but the biggest and the most variable piece of the spread is congestion. So if we don't have enough transmission infrastructure, you may have that very high spread that is also causing high congestion costs for the market. So basis, it's an additional risk to renewable assets those days, not for all projects, but for many. This procurement of C&I, we are hearing, Google, Amazon, many C&Is are interested in renewables, but every time you have this type of offtake, know that renewables are also wearing what we call this basis risk that causes the generator to wear the congestion cost between its interconnection point and the market hub where that settlement is. And this spread is very sensitive to congestion, grid outages, things that can happen on the system. I won't go too much through those slides. I have several slides showing examples of this challenge of congestion. The chart here on the left side with SPP is showing how this average spread to a market hub, the SPP South hub, has increased over the last several years with more wind on the system. On the right side, you will see how congestion has created a very big spread in 2022 compared to 2019 between this area in blue, purple, where you have a lot of wind, and the hub on the right. And you see that in contour map, the LMP heat map, you see that big difference. So some of those projects where this basis risk, where those very high price differentials, and that's a cost that wasn't anticipated, several years ago, 2019, for instance, because you weren't seeing that, you weren't anticipating that the transmission system will not keep up with the renewable build. So those are just examples, and this is another one where where grid outages are causing big differentials in LMPs because a lot of wind in SPP is on the west side of the footprint. And in this example, you see that a lot of this low-cost generation cannot reach the load on the east side of the footprint, and LMPs are higher on that side. And that was caused in this particular case by a material outage. And we have looked at constraints that were binding during this interval, during those months of outages. We have identified what constraints, we have identified even reconfiguration solutions, and I will talk shortly about reconfiguration, more about reconfiguration, but this is just an example of a situation where gates could have helped reduce the impact of the outage. So we see gates as an opportunity to reduce congestion and bridge the gap between the need for a lot of transmission investments in the future, wire-based, and what it is today. So gates, as Julia mentioned, can help better utilize the existing system. And being a long-term owner of those assets, we have always been very diligent about where we develop our projects, looking at developing in areas that have lower congestion risk. But the reality but it's not only us that develop in the market. It's not just EDF acting in the market. We have RTOs that determine, do the transmission studies and so on. So markets happen and have risk. So we have looked at many ways to reduce congestion for our fleet, and we came across the idea of GETS and have done a lot of studies for the last several years and have done a lot of work around GETS and have seen some of those GETS studies bear fruit in the sense of some of those reconfiguration solutions we have looked at and advocated for have been implemented. So with our very concrete experience, we have been very strong advocates of GETS because we see them as a bridge to reducing congestion, waiting for larger upgrades that could come from the interconnection and transmission planning processes. So we see GETS as a bridge solution, but also they can be used independently, not in combination with traditional upgrades, and in combination with traditional upgrades. So we see a plethora of options and of scenarios for which GETS can be a good solution for transmission constraints. And we have done a lot of work on specific initiatives across several RTOs, and I will be talking about this in the next few slides. The presentation here is focused on reconfiguration, but we have done a lot of studies with other GETS providers as well. And Julia talked about topology optimization, how you can think about it as a rerouting traffic. So I won't cover this slide, but and go directly to the processes and progress we have seen across RTOs. So the first one to talk about, it's MISO. A few of us, market participants, have started discussing about the need for reducing congestion, the need and the opportunity of topology optimization to be used for reducing this congestion that we see, especially in the MISO West footprint. So as a result of those discussions, we have started a process with MISO. There was over a year of discussions with different stakeholders within MISO, with MISO, IMM, and the result of all those discussions is having a process in place, which is a novelty in the RTO world. So MISO is the first RTO to have this type of process where EDF as a market participant can submit a reconfiguration request as a solution to identified constraint on the system. It can be a constraint that is persistent, we see binding a lot, or it can be something we are anticipating to see binding in the future driven by an outage. So it's great to see that this process exists where I can submit this request with the proper documentation. There are some criteria for documenting and demonstrating the need for evaluation, as well as criteria for evaluating and approving this request. So there is a source document here outlining the MISO process, but the takeaway on this slide and on MISO is that we are very happy to see and have worked towards the creation of this process whereby any third party can submit request for evaluating a topology optimization solution for a particular constraint. And MISO has a lot more statistics that they have talked about recently, but as the process is live, we have seen over 20 requests already submitted for the MISO footprint. And another one, another kind of like development in the RTO world is us trying to get to a similar process in SPP, EDF with a number of other market participants. We have a coalition supporting this initiative, which we call it in the SPP kind of documentation strategic roadmap initiative number 73. So we are working towards implementing a similar process as in MISO. The progress has been slow, but we are working and we are hoping to work towards a similar implementation of that process. And lastly, this is the last slide. We have actually, kind of like it is happening as we speak. Literally, we have submitted a revision request to allow evaluation of reconfiguration solutions for congestion management in ERCOT as well. ERCOT did have language about reconfiguration, but the language was limiting that those reconfiguration can be implemented only for reliability reasons. So you could do topology optimization if it was a reliability situation. However, now we are looking, and some of us have worked with ERCOT staff to tweak the language to allow for evaluation of those reconfigurations for economic justification as well for congestion management. There are many, many constraints in ERCOT that have over $1 million impact in the market. So this process is targeting those constraints, and the idea is to allow stakeholders to propose solutions, topology optimization solutions for those constraints. And this revision request proposing the language changes is being discussed those days, those weeks, and we do have support from IMM, and we hope to have as many supporters on those calls where those changes are being discussed and see this type of process successfully finalized. So in conclusion, we see a lot of curtailment and congestion already. We think the new Inflation Reduction Act will just increase this risk if there is not enough transmission expansion, if there is not enough deployment of GETs. We have worked EDF to create those collaborative processes, but those have been in the works anywhere from 1 year to 3 years. So this collaborative process takes a lot of time. We start to see some fruit now, but for large-scale deployment, as we all want to see, it will take a lot more than just a few of us working on the markets. And I hope to see more from FERC on this in the upcoming transmission planning order, but we need all of us to sponsor and voice our support for GETs to see an accelerated deployment of GETs. Julia, this concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rodica. And thank you for all of your work getting topology optimization moving forward at these RTOs. And I appreciate your point about the need for FERC to act. If anyone has questions for Rodica, please put them in the chat and we'll circle back to them. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Mark Norton, the Vice President of European Business Development at SmartWires.
Thank you, Julia. I'm just going to this presentation hopefully on the screen, and we're going to deep dive a little bit more into one of the technologies I'm going to talk to you today about: advanced power flow control. Julia very kindly introduced a slightly different visual, but the same concept. What are we looking at on the grid? Well, we have a network at this particular time that's overloaded. One of the circuits is above 100% and would be a constriction. It would become a bottleneck on the grid, and as a direct result would cause an issue involving either congestion or reconstraint or investment. And obviously it's being driven in part because of the fact that the power will flow around the system as it will. It will take the path of least resistance. If we look at using advanced power flow control and we put that on the system, as Julia mentioned earlier, we can push and pull on the circuits to rebalance it. In this case, we've got a perfect rebalance. Not always the case, but it is possible to get extremely close to that. And that then gives us a number of net benefits. It reduces the renewable curtailment. It can maximize the investment in new infrastructure that's going in. But it can also reduce the need perhaps to put that investment in or to rebuild a line or put a new line in the first place. So it works both ways. It's a gift that keeps on giving. You get the initial benefit maybe in deferring the need for some of the reinforcement, but in the longer term, as new reinforcement is added, you can also turbocharge that. You can get more out of it as well. In the example that we're actually seeing, this increase in capacity that we've actually achieved is, a 75% increase in capacity You may question about whether 75% is possible, but we've seen from many examples that it is. And as a direct result, that's a significant benefit to reducing things like interconnection queues or reducing operational grid challenges. I'm talking about power flow control here. The immediate thought for many people is to think about just trying to deal with ampacity or capacity needs on the system, but it's a very rapid response, and as a consequence, you can also do a lot to deal with more dynamic issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on one of the later slides. But let's just talk as well about the interaction with other GETS technology. So we go back to our original position. We've got the before situation, we've got an overload on one of the lines. In this case, the network's a little bit more loaded. So what we see is 120% on the line is overloaded, but both the adjacent lines are 100%. So you have an issue, where are we going to push the power to if we were to put advanced power flow control on. However, if we look at using another technology, and Robert will talk to you a little bit about this after this presentation, but we put in dynamic line rating. Now we can see that there's an increase in rating at various points across the year, which would effectively reduce the overload on that line. So it's gone from 120% to 105%, but it's also reduced the other two lines as well. You still haven't resolved the issue in its entirety, but you have actually made a marked improvement. If you then combine that with advanced power flow control, you can then rebalance the lines, use the capacity there, and by combining the two technologies, you get the same type of benefits. You have a wider number of use cases, and as a direct result, you've got a greater transfer capability than we saw in the first example. I've mentioned DLR, but it could also be, topography reconfiguration. It could be with storage. There's a number of other, tools that we can use on the system in order to combine. Some of those would fit into the GETS category. Others would be, other adjacent technologies. And as I said, advanced power flow control allows you to get the most out of all the assets you're putting on the grid. So let's still talk about some of its unique attributes and what makes advanced power flow control different from power flow control or other technologies. Well, the dynamic nature is one of the key points to be mentioned. It's a power electronics based technology almost exclusively, which allows you to control the power flow in a very precise way. It's basically a linear adjustments. You can do unlimited number of changes and movements of that adjustment to the power flow control, and you can do it in milliseconds. So it's very fast, it's very controllable, and it's not restricted by a number of mechanical actions, and you could use it throughout the whole of the year as a result. That lends itself to a number of network applications. Traditional power flow control, the one that most people think of from the point of view of, like I need to get more capacity through the circuits. But given the speed of response, you can also do things like adjust the voltages and give better voltage stability. You can adjust the stability margin and help with transient stability as well. Oscillation dampening is also possible as well. So a lot of the new issues that we're seeing that were quite unusual on the system and coming more commonplace now is an effective tool which you can multitask and respond to those issues as they arise. So you can put it in for one purpose, but then through various control modes, you can also use it to deal with new issues as they arise, or as I've said before, new infrastructure as it arises. It's modular in its design. So what does that mean? Well, it means the fact it's like building blocks or Lego. It's very flexible, it's very scalable. You can move deployments very rapidly. One of the examples I'll give, National Grid in the UK, we moved devices from one location to another in 3 days and put them into service. But it means also that you can design something and you don't have to commit yourself to the full deployment on day one. You can continue to add to the issue as it comes along, or you can spread out a development over a number of stages or years. And it doesn't require any major equipment replacement. It's just small additions. Very fast deployment, as already mentioned. Year to a year and a half could be the delivery time from conception to installation. And because of its modular nature, at worst, you're ever going to lose one unit. That will successfully bypass itself, so it will keep the circuit in continuity, which allows you to have a very high reliability and reduce the redundancy. And it's been proven at scale. This product is award-winning. It's been recognized by the World Economic Forum and a number of other bodies, Engineering Power Magazine, Institute of Engineering and Technology in the UK. So there's been a number of people that independently seen this, reviewed it, recognized the benefit, and supported it. Just to talk quickly about some strategic applications. If you look around the globe, it's being used heavily in North America, UK, Europe, Latin America, and Australia. You can see the kind of capabilities that are being brought to bear there. One of the projects in the in the US, which I'll talk about in a second, 185 megawatts of additional capacity has been unlocked. In the UK, I'll also touch on this one. There's 2 gigawatts of capacity on one of the places in the UK. Latin America, multiple projects, 800 megawatts in totality. And in Australia, the first stage of a multiple stage set of projects, 185 megawatts of capacity has already been released. A number of different people we're working with as we speak. I can't go into all of them today, so I'm just cherry picking some of those. But just to drill into a little bit lower level, I'll take 2 of those, one in North America and the UK. And Central Hudson is a project that we're working on as we speak. It's being commissioned and put into service. It's a project that was started in 2019. We put in a pilot deployment to allow Central Hudson to learn about the installation techniques and how to actually use the device. It's understand it and get to the feel of it and work with it better. The larger project that we're in the midst of installing now will lock 185 megawatts of capacity. It will be key to allow New York to reach its target of 70% of electricity by 2030. And it's a scalable solution. So what's going in today can be grown at a later stage. And at its present guise, it's expected to provide $10 million worth of saving to the system. But also it has a number of additional attributes. It's a smaller footprint, which is really helpful when compared to the alternatives, which was a fixed series capacitor, which was another part for driving towards this solution. But on top of that as well, there was other technical benefits as well, where there would have been difficulty with using a different technology due to subsynchronous resonance and the like. If I now switch across to the UK, and I'm sorry I'm moving so quickly, but time is of the essence, we can see perhaps where we've seen the greatest growth and the application of advanced power flow control, certainly within Europe, probably globally. There was an initial installation that was done over an 18-month period that unlocked 1.5 gigawatts. But before that was even completed and fully energized, the customer asked for an extension, which is National Grid UK, to 2 gigawatts. And that was then met and achieved. The original 1.5 gigawatts was already priced by the regulator to give £387 million, or as Julia's alluded to, around $500 million worth of savings when we look at the two levels in combination. But it's a solution that can still be expanded and relocated. It's on 5 lines in 3 locations. The expectation is, and looking at the longer term plans for National Grid, there may be over 20 projects. They're looking to unlock additional gigawatts of capacity and to support many of their offshore connections that are coming in, and the tens of gigawatts additional power they expect to be coming on over the next few years. It's been recognized as well as being particularly good for the local communities and the environment by minimizing disruption and reusing space within the existing substations that would have been difficult to access or would have been effectively sterilized. But it also provides operational flexibility to National Grid as a whole and ESO, and they've slowly, progressively bringing on the services that are actually using from post-fault to real-time system operation, and now they're looking at stability applications as well. So with that, I'm going to stop now, and I will hand over to Robert to talk to you about dynamic line rating. Thank you.
Let's see. Good afternoon, all. I am, let me see if I can share my screen here. or yeah, this will work. So we're going to transition to talk a little bit about dynamic line rating. As Mark mentioned, many of these technologies work together. We're used to sort of talking to one another in seeking to bring down barriers to these technologies and to try to figure out how to see them more broadly deployed. But just briefly, I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how sensor-based approaches to dynamic line rating work. So Julia, thank you. Just a little bit of basic background on physics. Dynamic line rating is all about temperature. The temperature of the atmosphere, the amount of wind blowing on the line, things like solar radiation and even precipitation can have a significant impact on the temperature of the electrical conductor in high voltage transmission lines. So if you can monitor that, you can figure out how close to the real thermal limits you are, and that can free up additional capacity. So next slide. So this is our version of a sensor-based dynamic line rating product, and there are several others, but basically the idea is to put sensors on the conductor itself, which measure, maybe most importantly, the temperature, but also the current, voltage, the angle, so that you can see how much sag that there is in the line. And once you start installing digital sensors, it's kind of like your iPhone. If you as long as you have a digital product you're putting out there, it's easy to add additional sensors. So there are a number of different things that can be included. This to look at vibrations and the ambient temperature, humidity. There are other possibilities, but basically these sensors are designed to be mounted on the line. They are powered by the current of the electricity flowing through the line, and they have backup batteries and so forth. One of the keys to these technologies, we think, is that they should take advantages of advances in mass production and the growth and capability of digital devices, and should bring them to how these technologies are deployed on the transmission lines. It used to be that dynamic line rating's been around for a while as a concept, but if you can design it to be have relatively inexpensive devices that are easy to install, and then provide useful, easy to understand data, which is then processed through all the things that big data and machine learning and so forth can do, it can provide much more actionable information. So part of that starts off here with what we show with the guy up the transmission tower with a hot stick, actually mounting these. These are designed to be very easy to install. Next slide, and we can even install them by drones. So I'm going to skip past this one because in the interest of time. Basically, how this works is we directly measure the line temperature. We combine that with weather data, and also our understanding through the formulas that are used to calculate DLR about how the weather data affects the line temperature. And then we take into account the kind of conductor type and other asset information, which gives us real-time data, but it also allows us to forecast what's going to happen on the line. And again, we look at weather forecasts for that data, and we can use things like machine learning and our processing of the data to be able to fairly accurately forecast how much capacity there is going to be on the line looking forward several days. Next slide. And this is some of the results. This is a duration curve over the hours of a year. You can see how many hours of the year you have significant extra capacity, and there are going to be other limiting elements on a transmission line, transformers, substations, so forth. But during much of the year, there's significant unused capacity because we've been relying historically on static line ratings or seasonal line ratings, which are overly conservative. The flip side is that there's also that little red piece of this graph, which shows that during part of the year, those conservative assumptions aren't quite conservative enough. So dynamic line rating has the virtue of identifying additional capacity during parts of the year when you need it, but it also tells you what's really happening and shows you when you should probably be a little more cautious than those static line ratings tell you you should be. Next slide. Just a little bit about forecasting. Again, I mentioned that we take the data from these sensors and we use it to not only calculate the real-time dynamic line rating, which you see here in the sort of brownish plot on the graph on the top set of lines, but you can also use it to look into the future, and then you can correlate it with weather data, and we are able to use machine learning to look at weather forecasts and think about how accurate those really are, and to be able to zero in on what's really happening and what we forecast with a really a higher and higher degree of accuracy. Next. Just a couple of use cases. I've included some very simple ones here, but we see these technologies, as the technology becomes more reliable and easier to use and less expensive, it's being installed in sort of much wider kind of system-wide applications. We have one project that we're starting on over here in Europe that will have thousands of kilometers of line that are instrumented either through software and weather forecasts, also combined with these sensors. But one of the most one of the nicest combinations of DLR with needs on the transmission system is with respect to wind, because at the same time that the wind is producing more power through the wind turbines, it's also cooling the lines. So you get not only more capacity, but more capacity when you really need it. So in this example, we had 10 of our sensors being installed, providing the additional capacity for significantly more megawatts from this wind park coming through at very low cost. But it's not only low cost. The other advantage of these technologies is they can be implemented very quickly. Traditional transmission expansions may take years, 10 years even. But you can deploy sensors like these within a matter of a month or two, and they start providing real-time data basically instantly, and then they can be fully calibrated for forecasting purposes in just a couple of weeks. One more. Just another example that not only is additional generation creating challenges on the transmission system, but additional load is also, and this can be very useful for that. So I think that is the end of my presentation, and again, trying to leave a little time for discussion here at the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robert. Yep, Hilary, take us away.
Great.
Just a reminder, though, to send questions in the Q&A. We might not have very much time for live Q&A, so we'll try to answer them in text. Anyways, go ahead, Hilary.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been great to listen to the fellow panelists and talk about grid enhancing technologies and the key benefits that they bring, and just how exciting it is to think about them in the context of Clean Energy Week. So my name is Hilary Pearson. I'm our Vice President of Policy and External Affairs at LineVision. We are a grid enhancing technology company that's based in Boston. We've installed over 400 units across 3 continents, and I'm excited to tell you a bit about our technology and some of our projects here in the US today. So, I think as you heard our fellow panelists talk about, there is just a very pressing need that we see and that is highlighted in a number of reports about the need to expand our transmission grid and to increase grid capacity in order to meet a number of, electrification and decarbonization goals. At a federal level, there's a goal for a net zero electric grid by the year 2035. At a state level, there's over 20 states that have goals or statutes for 100% clean energy, some with timelines coming as soon as the year 2030. So I think, as you heard Rodica with EDF talk about, there's a number of challenges involved, particularly on the generation side with bringing new clean energy projects onto the grid, also in trying to mitigate curtailments of those low-cost clean energy resources. And that, again, is a really key benefit that grid enhancing technologies have, is being able to address some of these fundamental challenges, in the short term, in the here and now, as we know that new transmission projects, which are critically needed, but simply come with a longer term timeline. There was a study done by the Department of Energy last year that looked at grid enhancing technologies and the ratepayer impacts. It was interesting looking in that study that showcased that there's essentially 6 different indicators for GETS deployments. So things, what is the relative share of renewable energy? What are the existing curtailments of that renewable energy? Transmission congestion levels, the price differentials related to the LMP that Rodica also mentioned, and then what are proposed transmission in a region, as well as proposed renewables in interconnection queues. So I think all of those 6 kind of criterias or indicators for GETS deployments were essentially referenced by some of the other speakers, but again showcased the ability for GETS to address some of these pressing issues and challenges in the short term at kind of a fraction of the cost and timelines that we see associated with traditional expansion projects. So in the case of LineVision and kind of how we are able to get that critical information, from the field in regards to ambient condition, wind speed, and the other things that Robert mentioned, we utilize a non-contact sensor. It's called Lux. It's installed essentially on a tower or a monopole. It can be installed quickly and without any outages. It utilizes a LiDAR scanning device, which you can see up at the top, which is powered by a solar panel and a battery unit. And by using the LiDAR device, which is also what helps to autonomous vehicles to be able to see, the Lux unit can monitor all phases of power, even bundled conductors with just that one sensor. So using that sensor data, it's able to help inform and validate some of our proprietary data models, which also includes the use of computational fluid dynamics, which is a method that can be used to help model wind speed for every span of a line. And again, I think as you heard, some of the other speakers mention, that wind speed component, it kind of has the greatest impact on the dynamic line rating, given that convective cooling capability that the line can experience. There was a study done by the Department of Energy a few years ago that showed a 3 feet per second increase in wind speed perpendicular to a conductor could increase its carrying capacity by up to 44%. So I know I'm going quickly, but want to certainly leave time for Q&A. This project here just highlights some of the projects that we're doing here in the US. So out on the West Coast in California, we're excited to be working with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. They're using the DLR capability for 2 lines that are tied to a hydropower facility in the Upper American River region of their service territory. So again, being able to use DLR to help ensure that those particular lines are potentially free of bottlenecks or constraints, and help ensure that that least cost clean energy hydropower is able to flow onto the network enough to I think it's to meet up to 20% of SMUD's customer demand with that least cost clean hydropower. The bottom two projects here with Avangrid and their NYSEG subsidiary, as well as National Grid, are both from New York State, who I think Smart Wires referenced has some bold state climate laws. So their Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, it does require 70% clean energy on the grid in New York by the year 2030. So the project with NYSEG, that is designed to, again, help to address congestion relief on some lines in their service territory. NYSERDA, the state energy office, helped provide funding for this project through their Future Grid Challenge program, which is, again, has focused on grid enhancing technologies deployments. And then National Grid, this is one where we're installed in the western region of the state, very renewable rich, but has constraints on the network, and utilizing the dynamic line rating solution, going to be able to help minimize and eliminate some existing wind energy curtailments, while also creating additional headroom for new renewable energy projects to come onto the grid. And I think, just in closing, one of the things to try to reference for folks, as you've heard, these technologies and their ability to help create additional transmission capacity, so 10%, 15%, 30%. There was, again, a study, a pilot project that happened in Encore in Texas about 10 years ago. It was funded through the Recovery Act. And in that project that looked at dynamic line ratings, they essentially found that even just a 10% increase in capacity on the lines with dynamic line ratings essentially eliminated all the congestion that was existing on those lines. So these numbers have meanings, and in regards to showing how these technologies and the capacity that they increase, what they're able to do. Again, it's really key when we think about clean energy and integration of these clean energy resources. So it's great to be here.
Great, thank you, Hilary. And I'll invite all the panelists to come back on. Just for our last couple minutes here, we had some good questions in the Q&A. We put in some answers, but I do want to take our last 2 minutes to address the question on utility incentives and the diverse models around the world, and why the United States' model might not be, or is not, incentivizing grid enhancing technologies. So Mark, maybe we can go to you first on the examples from Europe, and then if anyone else has some quick thoughts to share.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about while you're doing any project, grid optimization or otherwise, it's all the 5 W's and the 1 H, I suppose. What, who, what, why, how, and the how is the one that normally gets missed out. So what we've seen in Europe is that the likes of Rio, which is looking at trying to incentivize the right decisions. It allows for a portion of sharing of the benefits that are actually achieved by putting in new technology and a new innovation. That is a very hot topic at the moment. I mentioned in one of the questions we received today, in the fact that the benefit sharing, as it's called in Europe, is getting a lot of traction, and a lot of people are moving towards that kind of model. Aside from that, there are other incentive schemes. So there are things like an elevated RAB. So you get a higher return on your rate base is another option that people have used. That has been particularly effective in some countries to really push them down the road for innovation. So either of those two, personally, I favor benefit sharing. It really sort of revs up that move and really gets it going from not just 1 or 2 projects, but to a widespread adoption.
Great, thanks, Mark. And the Watt Coalition has proposed a similar benefit sharing framework to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it got some discussion in 2021. We'll see about moving it forward. Any other quick comments on?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in just briefly. FERC has required the implementation of ambient adjusted ratings across the U.S. by mid-2025, and that doesn't bring all the things that dynamic line rating brings. It doesn't take into account wind, which is the most important effect. But it has made utilities think about some of these issues more than they would have otherwise. And so we've found, particularly just recently here, that there's increasing interest. And so we hope that that's something that continued. And certainly there's an interest on the part of regulators in continuing to explore what these technologies can do, because they can add a lot of capacity quickly and at low cost compared to building traditional transmission expansion.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And we heard about some other incremental progress that we're seeing from Rodica at the RTOs. So looking for transformation, working on incremental progress, and looking for more allies in this work. So please get in touch if you have further questions or want to get involved. All right. Well, I think I'll close the webinar there. Thank you all for joining, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.